I'll give you two examples. So I mentioned these complaining patterns, and pre-COVID, they were really quite an issue because a lot of meeting time got sunk into these negative spirals, and complaining patterns are just one example. And so because in most virtual meetings, our social interaction is so deprived compared to face-to-face, right? We have much weaker nonverbal signals. We usually have a very small but noticeable delay between what we're actually doing and the camera signal, and then you processing what I'm doing right on the other end. So on the upside, something like a complaining spiral has become less likely. And on the downside, and I think this is the bigger concern, these positive dynamics that we know about. So sharing a laugh, engaging in these upward positive spirals together are also much less likely. And I think that's one of the main contributors to something that we know as Zoom fatigue. Getting tired and becoming tired of meetings and actually experiencing proper fatigue that relates to virtual meetings and not other experiences that we have, and also not linked to natural workday schedules.
We're in search of new rules for work, evidence-based practices fit for a hybrid world. This year, we're hosting a multi-month interdisciplinary research project looking for the best ways of unleashing team creativity. Join me, David Mastronardi, and my New Rules for Work co-producer, Elise Keith, as we explore the minds and the work of the people shaping not just our project, but the new rules for work. This project is made possible through the generous contributions of many people who are volunteering their time and through the support of our partners. To learn more about the project, buy tickets for January Symposium, register your team for the experiment, or partner with us, check out newrulesforwork.com. If you want to get in touch directly, email info@newrulesforwork.com.
Today, we are talking with Nale Lehmann Willenbrock, and she's the chair of industrial and organizational psychology at the University of Hamburg, Germany, where she also leads the Center for Better Work. It's a center where they bring the insights from research into organizational practice. She currently also serves as the associate editor for the Journal of Business and Psychology, as well as small group research. So I know this from having looked at her work in the past. I've read all kinds of papers by Nale. She's clearly intrigued by the fine-grained behavioral patterns that link meetings to individual team and organizational functioning. Her research on social interaction dynamics in meetings, in teams, and between leaders and followers has been published in top-tier academic outlets with more than 100 journal articles and book chapters to date. She's edited 2 books and a special issue on the science of workplace meetings together with Dr. Joe Allen, who we talked to earlier. So we are thrilled to have Nale bring this vast body of insight and research and just real clarity about how to do the science of meetings well to this program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Nale, where are you in the world right now?
So I'm in Hamburg, Germany, which is not the best place to be at the moment because it's winter and it's raining nonstop, which is unfortunately very typical for the city. And we had this icy rain this morning, so it was actually kind of dangerous to leave the house. But on the upside, lots of virtual meetings today, so we have lots to talk about.
Oh, good. So you didn't have to leave the house.
No, I didn't have to leave the house.
I was really interested in this sentence in your bio, the fine-grained behavioral patterns that link meetings to individual team and organizational functioning. Can you talk about what you do and maybe how that is or fits into what it is that you do?
Okay, so if this were a research setting, I would be trying to put as many sensors as we have on each of us, right? So each of us would have an individual mic and an individual camera, and ideally also other things. So I've used accelerometer badges, for example. So they look like little conference tags that you put on individual participants, and they can automatically track your movement in the meeting space. And there are other things. So whatever we can get to measure sort of the nitty-gritty social behavior that people show during their meetings. So I would be here and trying to record all this. And then afterwards, one of my lucky research assistants would get to really dig deep and analyze every single little behavior, right? So whether this is verbal behavior or nonverbal behavior. And in terms of verbal patterns, we've looked at fun things like complaining patterns, for example, which are quite systematic, particularly in German samples. So we see over and over again in lots of different organizations, lots of different industry settings, that when one person starts complaining about the weather or the terrible boss or the state of meetings or why we're here in the first place, it's pretty likely that somebody agrees with them. And then it's even more likely that there's another complaining statement, and then they get stuck in this negative loop very quickly. And this happens over and over again and wastes a lot of valuable collaborative time. So this is something we've looked at. We've also, on the upside, looked at things like humor patterns and positivity spirals. So it also works in the positive directions, these systematic patterns, but they're not as likely and they're not as frequent, unfortunately, compared to the negative group dynamics that we see. Yeah, so I mainly view meetings as sort of like vessels for group dynamics and this very rich interactive space that are fun to explore for psychologists like me.
That's fascinating.
Does that answer your question?
Does it brings up the image of, I don't know if it's video games or movies, when they have the people in the suits and they've got the sensors on all of the different joints in there. That seems like that's what you're doing, but in the sense of
like
meeting collaboration.
Right? Yeah.
Right.
So we're not that techy yet, particularly because my favorite topic is meetings in the actual field. And as you might imagine, if you go into a company and you say, hey, would you let me look at what are your meetings? You're very lucky if somebody says, yes, you may, after lots of lunches and getting to know teams and earning your trust, of course. But you have to make this as less intrusive, or at least the least intrusive you possibly can. So putting in a camera might be okay. Sometimes we don't get to put up a camera. Sometimes it's just an audio tape, but whatever we can get to get at their actual behavioral dynamics, we'll deal with, because it's a field setting and those are the most exciting data sets we can get our hands on. There's other things we can do in the lab. So the really techie setups usually happen in the labs. And particularly if we think about immersive meetings, so something happening in the metaverse, for example, that's something we're currently looking at in lab settings with student groups, because it's sort of early days that we need to explore and sort of fine tune the data gathering setup in the first place. We're not really anywhere near inviting real teams from the field to participate in these types of studies. So bottom line, more techie typically means lab settings.
Okay. You mentioned complaints and complaints snowballing. You mentioned humor patterns in a positivity spiral. These are all behaviors that maybe were established pre-pandemic. What have you noticed? How have these last 2.5 years shifted what you do and what you're seeing in terms of behavior patterns and how they're impacting collaboration?
So first off, the pandemic and particularly the first lockdown, at least in Germany, has sort of kick-started meetings, and not only the rate of meetings, but also the salience. So how much attention people pay to their meetings, how much value is attached to the meeting. Suddenly meetings became something that made sure there's any kind of social relationship left in organizations. So the one thing that kind of kept people going and kept them tied to your organization. We really desperately needed meetings to figure out what the heck we're doing, to make sense of everything. So that was one dramatic change. I also noticed there was more media interest in meetings, and the same is true for colleagues working on the phenomenon. So from sort of a niche subject that a few folks in various social sciences were interested in, suddenly became this massive fad, something that a lot of scientists were kind of latching onto and suddenly thinking, oh, this is cool. This should be a phenomenon that gets research interest of its own and not just as a context for studying something else. So that was definitely a change in the broader field. So from a relatively small community that called themselves meeting scientists before the pandemic, suddenly it's become a growing club of researchers. And in terms of the actual patterns inside the meetings, it feels like it was kind of a slow process, but it's also a lasting change in a good way and in a bad way. So I'll give you 2 examples. So I mentioned these complaining patterns, and pre-COVID, they were really quite an issue because a lot of meeting time got sunk into these negative spirals, and complaining patterns are just one example. And so because in most virtual meetings, our social interaction is so deprived compared to face-to-face, right? We have much weaker nonverbal signals. We usually have a very small but noticeable delay between what we're actually doing and the camera signal, and then you processing what I'm doing. right? On the other end, there's some delay in audio, even when there's good audio setup. And we all know about all of the fun little technical difficulties and failing Wi-Fi and so forth, all of these disruptions that lead to less natural group interactions. And they also lead to, they sort of lower the likelihood of these naturally occurring patterns that we knew before the pandemic. So on the upside, something like a complaining spiral has become less likely. And on the downside, and I think this is the bigger concern, these positive dynamics that we know about, so sharing the laugh, engaging in these upward positive spirals together, are also much less likely. And I think that's one of the main contributors to something that we know as Zoom fatigue. Getting tired and becoming tired of meetings and actually experiencing proper fatigue that's linked to virtual meetings and not other experiences that we have, and also not linked to natural workday schedules.
So I might be oversimplifying here. I thought I heard you say some of the negative patterns and some of the positive patterns have been reduced. Are we discovering new patterns emerging? Are there net new patterns in these settings, or are we still figuring out how to even detect them?
I think a little bit of both. So there are new patterns, and one pattern that is new or relatively new compared to the situation before the pandemic is that we're increasingly paying attention to ourselves in the meeting, because most of us have this little self view, right? That you can turn off, but who does, right? Because what if my hair doesn't look good and other people notice, right? Who turns off their self view? And I've tried doing this. I've also encouraged my colleagues doing this. And in the end, sometimes I forget. And it's also, we've gotten so used to it that we just leave it on. But of course, this does something to our attention span, right? So if I spend some of my individual attention constantly on looking at my own image in a meeting, and it's just too tempting to not do it, right? Then that attention is no longer there to listen to others or to pay attention to the fine, very little nonverbal dynamics that maybe my colleagues are showing. And I no longer catch that maybe Elise actually wants to speak up, or maybe David is getting tired because part of my attention is always on my little self-image. So that, of course, changes the likelihood that certain group patterns can even emerge. And I think, yeah, it's hard to get away from that. It's also funny sometimes if I look at natural face-to-face student interactions now, because even those seem weird, right? Because people no longer have this feedback tool that they've gotten so used to during 2 years or more of the pandemic. So it's really changed our social behavior to some extent. And I think, yeah, it's partly funny, but it's also sad if you think about the consequences for our behavior as social human beings.
So I think I just heard you say self-view has been so intrusive that it's actually keeping us from connecting.
Yeah. Yeah. And as another example, sometimes it's just been necessary to have the self-view. So one of my PhD students had this, I thought at first I was shocked, and then I laughed, and then I was shocked again. And I still tell this because it's such a good example of what happened during the pandemic. So she was teaching a virtual course, and what happens during most virtual courses is all of the students turn off their camera, right? Maybe because they're not comfortable showing their not so fancy student rooms, maybe because they're in their PJs, maybe because they're not actually there. We don't know, right? But the effect on the teaching staff is that they get zero nonverbal feedback, which can be really bothersome, right? So you're trying to crack a joke, you're trying to get a message across, and there's no feedback at all. So what she said was she deliberately always leaves herself beyond, because at least somebody smiles back at her every once in a while. That's very sad, but it works. And we know from other research that this works, right? Even if you fake smile at somebody, that other person will smile back. So apparently this also works as sort of a self-sustaining pattern in social meetings. So yeah, there are good reasons to keep the self-view on, if only to have some nonverbal feedback, particularly when you're presenting and you don't see anyone else.
The nonverbal feedback that we were getting when we were in the same room, we may have just been, I don't know that we even paid attention to it, if we even knew that was part of the experience until it went away. Now we're experiencing the lack of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a lot of aspects of meetings that we were not even aware of that we could have cherished because we didn't know this was meaningful, right? I mean, this is true for a lot of good things that happen to us in life, where we don't really even notice they were there until they're gone. And then suddenly, oh no, it's terrible that the coffee machine broke, right? And before I didn't even notice. Right? So the same goes for a lot of aspects of our social interactions at work. Another thing I just thought about, because initially you asked about like changes in behavioral dynamics because of the pandemic and the increase of virtual meetings. So related to this issue of looking at yourself and the issue of other people turning off their camera, so who do you relate to? One of the key constructs that get disturbed in a lot of virtual meeting interactions is this idea of even feeling like in a group, right? So right now there's 3 of us. We all have our cameras on like good meeting citizens. And so I can see you guys and sometimes you'll smile back at me and it seems at least like you're paying attention and that makes me feel better, right? And it also makes me feel like we're a group because I have all of the nonverbal signals that you can send me using this 2D virtual platform. So that's helpful. Now, if one of us were to turn the camera off, suddenly that person would be only half there, if even, right? Or only there in theory. So suddenly we're a dyad and not a group. And that, of course, changes our dynamics. And if you imagine a typical presentation setting in a meeting where one person has their camera on, or maybe nobody has their camera on, everybody's staring at a shared slide set, nobody feels like they're in a group. And so if you don't feel like you're a group, or what we as psychologists call group entitativity, and Joe might have talked about this already, if we don't feel like we're in a group, how are we going to ever develop meaningful group dynamics, right? So the key ingredient is missing already in a lot of virtual meetings, or at least parts of virtual meetings.
That's where I was going to go. Have you noticed this? I'm imagining, or my assumption as you're explaining this is much of the meetings that you're describing are Zoom only. Because right now we're just in Zoom. Some meetings have emerged to have maybe some work getting done in them, maybe some kind of collaborative document, Google Docs, or some of these digital whiteboards. Have you noticed any difference, or what might be some comparisons where it's a meeting that is purely a discussion-based meeting versus something that might have a working element to it, a collaborative beyond discussion element to it? Does that change the dynamic at all?
Yeah, definitely. So ideally, people also know how to work with those various collaborative tools, right? So I've been in a lot of meetings where somebody had the really good intention to add something like an interactive whiteboard, for example, and then maybe 2 out of 10 participants actually know how to use that thing. So that means those 2 people had a fairly good meeting experience, also because they really shaped where the group was going, because everybody else was still trying to figure out how to put up a platform on that thing. And so, yes, those collaborative tools are great if everybody actually knows how to use them and spend some time getting familiar with it. And as in face-to-face life, we all have our different preferences and experiences and so forth. So that can make it a little bit harder. But I would say if it's set up well and people know how to use this technology, the beauty of those tools is it's documented, right? So this is something that can often get lost in face-to-face meeting because we get carried away talking, and because of our nonverbal dynamics sort of being so grabbing our attention so much, we can get carried away and fail to document the meeting progress. So that can actually be a huge benefit of a well-conducted virtual meeting using collaborative tools that everybody can contribute, and it's clear what the results are, and it's documented. It doesn't go away. We don't lose what we've talked about.
I don't study this academically, but just from a purely observational standpoint, I've noticed sometimes when you go into, say, a breakout room and you're there with fewer people than, of course, we're in the bigger room, I've noticed cameras turned on where they might have been off, but I've also noticed that you can detect engagement without the camera, so you can see if a cursor is moving around, or now Zoom allows you to see, as if you're given certain permissions, you can actually see if microphone levels are going up or down, or if people in the breakout rooms have cameras on and off. And I've certainly noticed differences in plenary versus smaller group breakouts. The small group has been given a task, and they have to do something before they come back.
So I think that's an accountability issue as well as a group size issue, right? So we're more likely, or it's easier to hide in a larger group, right? We can sort of get away with turning off our camera. And it might also feel less comfortable to put your camera on if you're in a larger group. So of course, it's also dependent on the person's personality, right? If you score really high on introversion, you might feel really awkward turning your camera on in a group of 30 people. So that's something we shouldn't forget before we make everybody turn on their camera at all points. So it could be about like how comfortable are you with your camera on in a large versus a smaller group, but it's also accountability. So of course, if you give a group a task and a deadline, you say you have to deliver something to the plenary after this deadline, there's no hiding behind your turn off camera, right? That makes it a lot harder. Yeah. So of course, that's also a design issue, right? What's on the agenda? How much time do you give or allot to each task? Can you plan that well ahead? And who's held accountable in the end? Which works for some meetings and for some topics, but for some others, it's just really dependent on people engaging and being willing to discuss and contribute.
So you've got things that you're talking about that are about interpersonal interaction. And I've never understood how to pronounce this word. Antiativity? Is it the groupiness? Antiativity?
Feeling like you're in a group. Basically.
I was talking to Joe about it. He's like, yeah, it's the groupiness factor. So we've got all of these things that are about negative doom loops and positive spirals that are how we are as people. And all those things existed in the in-person meetings as well. And in the remote meetings, we have techniques like turning off our self-view, or do I look at the camera to make it look like I'm giving you eye contact, even though I'm really looking at my camera, which is weird. And one thing I've noticed with the remote meetings is because there's so much technology involved and so many steps to take account of, people have put a little bit more attention into the design of, do I use something like a breakout? Do I use something like an interactive whiteboard and whatnot? And you were just talking about, okay, that's about accountability, right? Does the group have a task? Does it have a deadline? So are you seeing in that interaction between the design of how meetings go and the social factors of talk or fatigue or all of those things, are you seeing that ratio change at all now that we're in a more remote first kind of world compared to how much attention design got when everything was just in person?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely a stronger emphasis on good meeting. Have to plan ahead, also because many of us have experienced so many terrible virtual meetings. So that's definitely raised the stakes for good meeting design and planning ahead and thinking about how much time we need, how much to put on the agenda, thinking about giving people breaks, because somehow this doesn't happen naturally any longer, right? When we had to walk from one meeting room to the next, we had our natural little break. No longer happens. We have to plan ahead. We have to give people breaks and schedule our meetings accordingly. So yeah, that definitely takes more planning and more thinking ahead. And also collaboration tools need planning, right? They need setup. They need people to think about it and get familiar with those tools and so forth. I think what hasn't really changed is the impact or the importance of group dynamics inside the meeting. Because even with a really well-scheduled, really well-designed virtual meeting, if people don't contribute, you're stuck, right? If people don't engage, if they're not interested, if they don't come up with good ideas, you should have all these beautiful collaborative spaces and you end up with very little other than frustration for the meeting leader. So that hasn't really changed. It really is up to the meeting group as a whole what comes out of the meeting. I think that's pretty much the same as it was in natural face-to-face settings before the pandemic. And I'd like to emphasize that every time I talk about practical implications of my research, it's not just up to the meeting leader to design great group dynamics, right? So I can be very well trained as a meeting leader. I can be super motivated. If my group decides to get stuck in complaining valley and decides not to move out of it, I can do whatever I want. They're going to complain for that full hour if they must, right? So that really is not just the meeting leader's responsibility. He or she can do lots of things to try to not let them end up there and try to pull them out. But sometimes groups do what they do because they're groups and they're powerful, and group dynamics can overrule meeting leaders. And that happens both in face-to-face and virtual settings all the time.
So the thing we talk to clients about all the time. It's like, hey, it's a team sport. So good news. There are other responsible adults in the room who are meant to help you get this result. So it's not all on your shoulders. It's got both a good and a bad, right? You can't control it. But you also don't have to.
I think that, so it's less burden on the meeting leader, but it also means if you walk out of a virtual meeting and you feel like, wow, this was an hour of my life completely wasted, then you should look at yourself. Like, what did I do? Right? You let it happen. So it's partly your fault. That's the other consequence, I think.
Along those lines, Nala, have you seen more than just anecdotally organizations who have gotten this transition right? And if so, what might they be doing a couple layers deep? And so again, it's not just the tech, it's not just the meeting leader, but what's happening culturally from some, whether they did it deliberately or not, I don't think it matters, but maybe we can take examples and be more deliberate about it. But what have you observed helps to get this culture right?
So what we observed from our qualitative work looking at reasons for Zoom fatigue, right? That was our original research interest in that study, was that meeting leaders came up with really good strategies for dealing with this lack of group dynamics that we've been talking about today. So from things like cracking a joke early on to making socialization time possible early in the meeting. So what Joe and I talk about when we meet pre-meeting talk, that's something that doesn't tend to occur in virtual meetings. You really need to make time and space for it and help that happen as a meeting leader. So really thinking about, okay, so what needs to happen in the meeting and also in that little time around the meeting. So either the socializing phase early on or the phasing out, that can really help. Or they've talked about openly addressing people's well-being, which is new, right? So this is not something that tended to happen pre-pandemic. We didn't typically go into a professional business meeting and say, hey, how are you guys actually feeling today? Okay. So that's definitely a change, not only in terms of meeting content, but also the mindset and also a change in organizational culture that I think is for the better. So yeah, in that case, the pandemic actually did some good things. And I also think organizations who've walked away from particularly the first couple of lockdown weeks relatively unfazed were those that relied on more of a participative culture, right? So asking people, what do you need? How are you feeling? What can we do to make your very unusual, very difficult work life as good as we possibly can? Letting them speak up, but also mess up without necessarily raising a big fuss because it was a different organizational routine that I needed some figuring out. So having this sort of open feedback culture and also leaving room for errors and what we call psychological safety, right? So making people feel like it's okay to speak up and it's also okay to be wrong and you don't get punished for it. All of those are helpful things in dealing with any crisis, but the COVID situation in particular.
So it sounds like you had a finger on the pulse of what's going on here before, after doing your own research. What curiosity are you hoping for the new rules for work mega study or field study to give you some more insight on? Why say yes to helping us out? What's your curiosity here?
So at least can be really convincing. So it's hard to say no. Plus, Joe was already on board and he kind of said, like, you should join. So I felt like I should. So there was an added social pressure in joining this effort. No, but in a good way. I'm joking. I'm curious. So I'm curious how this new type of research and this new participation format is going to turn out. It's a new way to recruit study participants for sure. It's also a new way to design research. It's very, lots of interest groups are involved in the design, sort of, creative in the process itself. So not just the meetings themselves, but also the design process is new and creative and collaborative. And I'm curious to see where that's going to go. So that's very interesting. And of course, I'm also looking forward to the types of insights that we get about potentially better meeting design, but particularly also this intersection that we talked about between how the meeting is designed and how the group dynamics inside the meeting unfold because of that design. And maybe also what happens over the course of those meetings, right? So one thing that we kept seeing before the pandemic and the types of field studies that I've been running is often what happens in the early phase of a meeting. So let's say like the first 2 to 3 minutes kind of determines how the rest of the meeting is going to go. So I wonder how that's going to work in these experiments, right? Is this also something that we see that interaction patterns establish early in the meeting and then you're sort of stuck for better or worse? Or is there more fluctuation in terms of the patterns that we see unfold? And I have 3 or 4 more research questions that I'm interested in, but we can maybe not dive too deep. But those are the main questions that I think will be cool to figure out. So particularly around design and how that triggers certain group dynamics inside the meeting.
So that's true where those first couple of minutes pattern the behavior for the rest of the meeting, and maybe you get locked into, for good or for bad, you get into that and it's hard to get out of.
I could see that being super fascinating in the experiment, because I know there are some designers that always break the group into small groups, like within the first 5 minutes, right? So you've got interaction patterns and experiences set completely differently by all the sub-teams within the larger team. Yeah. Because what if your first conversation is with somebody you just really are not digging? So many variables.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what also happens, all these separate groups establish their own little group climate, right? And what if they then come back into a plenary session and they realize, oh, we're all very different from one another. I don't want to talk to those guys anymore, right? Because if they had a really good experience, that's what we would expect from a psychology perspective. We would expect there to be fault lines between all those little subgroups, right? So we had these cool ideas in Group A. I don't think Group B really got the task right. So you could have these between group difficulties as well if you break them up into small groups early and then let them reunite later. So that could happen. And there's also, of course, the effect of the meeting lead, right? So depending on their behavior and their level of enthusiasm and also their behavioral repertoire. So some meeting leaders are really great at first being inspiring and then pulling back. Others are only great at inspiring, but don't really know when to pull back and let the participants take over. So their behavior, of course, also has an effect on what the group does and how they behave. So all of those are things we can study in the experiment.
So I have one curiosity on this. In this particular event, so we're looking at the symposium coming up in January, and we've opened registrations, and we have people from over 20 countries coming. I know most of the meeting research tends to be European and US based. Are there things that you're curious about that have to do with data coming from other parts of the world? Or do you expect that to be fairly similar?
So Joe and I have worked a little bit with intercultural data on meetings. So in particularly, we've been interested in this phenomenon of meeting lateness. So people coming late to meetings, which they still do, also virtually, unfortunately. And we had examples from the US, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, China, and Chile. I know, hopefully I'm not forgetting anybody, but I think that's it. And so we also had them include these typical cultural value scales, right? Like whole status, collectivism, individualism, and so forth. And so this was a side finding. I mean, we were mainly interested in lateness and interested in whether we could establish that this was actually a global phenomenon. And lo and behold, it is. People are late everywhere, and they're not that different in their lateness across different cultures, which is probably also because we're becoming more similar in our business practices due to globalization. At least that's my hypothesis. But what we also found, interestingly, and this is not in the paper because this is like a side note, these cultural scales no longer showed established differences that at least I've read in my textbooks as a psychology student. So it seems like, at least if you compare people working in business settings who are having regular meetings, right? That was a recruitment criterion for the study. They tend to become more alike also in their cultural values. And so for the experiment, of course, not anybody is participating, but those who are participating are really interested in the topic and they really want to contribute. And so, of course, we have a selection effect there, right? So there are probably people often have meetings. Why else would they be interested? They probably have their set of meeting experiences that they bring to the table, good and bad. And they might actually have a somewhat similar career history, even though they're from different cultures. So I wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing similar behavioral patterns, even though people are from very different places across the globe. On the other hand, we also know there are distinct cultural differences. So I started talking about complaining patterns earlier. Joe and I published a paper where we looked at complaining patterns and other things in groups having meetings in Germany versus in the US. And we did find sort of fine-grained, subtle differences. So our US teams were much quicker to talk about solutions and ideas when the Germans were still talking about problems and trying to analyze root causes of problems. And we also saw complaining in the German, but not the US group. So hence, a mainly German phenomenon, could be a cultural dimension there. So if we look at the fine-grained behavioral dynamics, we do know there are cultural differences.
So did I
And
hear
finally,
you?
probably also conversation share. So I think that's something we're measuring as a control variable somewhere, but of course it makes a difference if they're all speaking English, whether they're a native speaker or not, and how quickly they're talking is also going to affect their meeting behavior and how much they can participate and get a word in. Sorry, I totally interrupted you.
No, you had a list of three.
Also very German.
Keep it all together.
What's that?
That's also very German, but I apologize. Go ahead.
No, you were in the flow. I was interrupting. You had mentioned, I think, a couple of points back about people taking on, even cross cultures, similar behaviors. And I was curious because I think there's something called propinquity, is this tendency for us to either take on the affectations or the behaviors of the people within the 50 feet of us at the office. We become like them. We actually develop affinities for them. Is this a version of digital propinquity? Because we're spending, even cross cultures, the same kind of transference is happening digitally?
That's an interesting hypothesis. I don't think I've ever seen a study on propinquity in virtual meetings, but it would be a cool one. But what has been happening is people calling studies so-called social mimicry. So this is also something I've been working on together with computer scientists because they're really fabulous at measuring very fine-grained nonverbal patterns that are not necessarily visible to the eye, and also combining behaviors across different modalities, right? So all of us are constantly sending audio and vision cues and also movement. And it's hard to get all of that together, at least in my little psychologist head, but the computer scientists know how to do that, or at least know how to program their machine learning algorithms who can do that. What's particularly interesting in this area called social signal processing, which is sort of a subdomain of computer science that's been growing in the past couple of years, is this idea of mimicry behavior. And what you're describing, so becoming more like people around us, is an instance of mimicry, right? So if you're leaning forward a lot or you're talking really fast, chances are other people in the meeting are going to latch onto that behavior and behave similarly. However, I think this is challenged in at least 2D virtual setting, right? So normally in a face-to-face meeting, you have the full nonverbal picture, right? So you know how much I'm moving in the room. You can see my body posture. You can maybe even realize from my breathing pattern that I'm about to speak, right? So we wouldn't have had this interruption moment where I didn't know you were going to talk and you didn't know I was going, right? Because we're missing cues here. And so if mimicry happens in virtual spaces, it's probably a little bit harder because we have to pay attention enough in the first place. And there's also these little slightly delayed social signals due to camera and audio issues that can make it harder, but it still happens, of course. And what we know from social science is when mimicry happens, it's usually a good sign. So it facilitates bonding, it facilitates liking, it enables things like rapport. So it's a really important sort of small social process that also happens in meetings. And when it does, it usually means the interaction is flowing very well.
Purchasing similar equipment be a sign of that as well? Or maybe even making the background. I've made some changes to my background because I was on a call and I really like, so beyond just behavioral and picking up the social cues, but
yeah. I don't know.
Oh, wow.
Again, from Ro, if I have a really big plant in my background, then you know you're like, oh, this is right.
Look, I've been hanging out with Elise a lot.
And now look.
I think we have the next study on our hand. So Nala, I want you to imagine it's a year from now and the new rules for work field study, mega study has gone really well. And maybe we're in Hamburg catching up in person instead of online. And we're talking about what's gone so well and what, in your mind, what are we talking about? What are some of the details? What are some of the findings that you're really happy about a year from now?
Okay, so the first thing I would be really happy about is if it actually works out and we get this massive sample of behavioral data, right? Because like I mentioned, somewhere between lines, it's usually quite painful to get field data, let alone behavioral field data. So this is hard for many reasons, also privacy issues and so forth. So that would be cool because it would essentially be a vast playground for lots of researchers, not just the ones I'm currently on board. So that would be cool. And then from more of a practical perspective, I think it would be really neat if we had some novel insights into how to create better meeting experiences for everyone. We know so much of our work time is stuck in meetings for better. It's not going to change because of the type of work that a lot of us are doing. We do need to talk to one another. And so I think if we can sort of identify 2 or 3 screws that you can sort of wiggle and magically your meetings become better, that would be really impactful for many reasons, right? So this could have implications for how we select and train our leaders. This could have implications for how we assemble teams. It could have implications for employee well-being. We know there are so many outcomes linked to particularly bad meeting experiences that find a couple of ways to make them better is going to be really impactful.
So just to pick up on something that you said right there, pick leaders. You think this ability to facilitate or to run a good meeting is, now my words here, directly correlated to leadership as we go forward?
Absolutely. I mean, even now, if you think about where people exert social influence, it's in social interactions. You can't lead without somebody there who reacts to you, right? Even through email, right? It's a type of social interaction. And so I think meetings are a really powerful leadership setting because you usually, unless it's a one-on-one, you can reach more than one person. And you also have insights into group dynamics that are otherwise hidden from you as a leader. So being able to navigate that space well, absolutely is a crucial leadership skill and has been even before the pandemic, except for that nobody really noticed how important that behavior was. So another way to view this, I think, is if you're in a meeting and you're looking at what your leader does or doesn't do, it's kind of like a magnifying lens on their qualities as a leader, right? So it really, you can't really pretend like it doesn't matter what you do in your meetings as a leader. You're really exposed and you should be equipped with the skills to do that well. So yeah, I think those could be insights also gained from the experiments. What can we do and what could leaders do differently? And I talked about leader selection as well deliberately, because I think it's not just about training people and currently already in leadership positions, but also thinking about, okay, so what does that mean in terms of qualities that we're looking for in future leaders? And how can we select the right candidates, but also train them well before they're there to mess up the meeting?
That's amazing. So it's a great segue into really our last question, which is, what is the most important job skill for the next 5 years?
I want to say maintaining your status as a social human being despite everything. And that sounds really vague, but what I mean by that is a lot of the changes in work, whether we call this new work or something else, but a lot of the changes have changed or affected our interaction paradigms at work, whether we're in a leader position or a regular team member. And it's been difficult and it's put a strain on our social relationships at work. And it's been a draining experience for many and it affected people's well-being. And so I think being able to manage that and being able to use technology for the best purpose there is, namely to your relationships and make them better and maybe even improve collaboration beyond what we're able to do in face-to-face settings. I think that's going to be the crucial skill. So feeling like a social being, even though we're just in front of the screen for a lot of the time.
That's really insightful, especially with all the chat GPT buzz going on right now, right? Or
yeah.
People are worried that the robots are going to take your job.
I think that's very unlikely.
Right. I think.
So I do like robots. There's some really cute robots. I mean, yeah.
Nale, if people want to learn more about you, your work, your books, where can we send them?
Send them to Hamburg in person. I do like a face-to-face interaction. That wasn't clear by now. And if that doesn't work, they can find me at the University of Hamburg. They can also find our center at betterwork.uni-hamburg.de. And if they can spell my last name, they can also just Google me, right? Okay. Or I think if you enter Nale plus meetings, you got me as well.
And to clarify, that's Nale.
Yeah.
Not Nala.
Not Nala, as in the Lion King. I get that a lot, but it's Nale.
Nale, thank you so much for this interview, this really insightful and helpful interview, but also for advising and shaping the course of this project. It's better off with your participation.
Thank you. My pleasure. We'll see where it goes.
We will. Thanks for listening. To learn about the new rules for work, purchase tickets, or submit your team for an experiment, check out newrulesforwork.com. If you're interested in partnering, reach out to us at info@newrulesforwork.com.